Hey Sopranos fans, welcome to another episode here on Bully Whispers, and we are here today to discuss how things may have played out had Jackie Aprile Sr. not died from cancer and instead had been alive when his brother Richie got out of prison.
Always with the scenarios.
Now, this is a discussion episode, so I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on different aspects down in the comments, but before digging in, I got a couple of three things to mention. First, we are operating not only on the idea that Jackie Sr. didn't die, but also that he wasn't arrested like Junior ended up being at the end of Season 1. Second, if Jackie didn't die, then Tony would have never become boss, which in and of itself may seem obvious, but it's still important to keep that in mind because it means that what Tony wants won't carry nearly as much weight as it does in other episodes. And lastly, if Jackie didn't die, then Tony and Junior would have never fought over the top spot, which again is obvious, but important to keep in mind because it means that the tension between the two would be far less moving forward, and maybe Mikey Palmise is still alive. So in this episode, we will discuss the scenario of Jackie Sr. being alive when Richie got out of prison by first taking a look at the time frame right after Richie's release, including things such as his demeanor, entitlement, perspective, and how Jackie being alive would have affected them, before moving on to what Richie would have wanted, how Jackie would have likely responded, and all of the different tensions that would create. Then we will take a look at any potential long-term problems and whether or not Jackie and Richie would have coexisted, as well as entertain the idea that Jackie dies a year or two after Richie's release, creating a power vacuum, and of course running into Jackie Jr. all along the way. Now, Richie's first scene after being released is when he's dropped off at Beansy's pizza joint, and though it's a minor point, I think it's safe to assume Beansy would have been better off. If Jackie had been alive, it would have meant one of two things. Either A, he was still under Jackie, in which case Richie wouldn't have gone after him like that, so he would have been good, or B, he was free with Jackie's active blessing, which means he may have been good, but not necessarily, and the reason why can be found in 3 lines that may prove to be quite significant moving forward. First,
Don't do what? Take what's owed to me.
What's owed to you? I need about $350.
he wants to take what he is owed, and he feels he is owed a lot. Second is the very first line we hear him say to Tony.
Look at you, fucking Ken. You look great. You're all sinew.
You suck as shit.
You lose that baby fat, you disappoint me. Hey, fuck you.
We all know that Richie, like Feach, had a hard time accepting that life had moved on, but this takes it a step further into what feels like a subtle attempt to put Tony back in his place, so to speak. Now, during the first time watching the series, it seems like just a couple of guys roasting each other, as guys tend to do, but watching it after getting to know Richie, it feels more like a subtle reminder of seniority, which is further reinforced by a line from a frustrated Tony.
I talked to him yesterday. There's no sweetness and lights. Look at this big brother shit's getting old.
Keeping in mind that all of this happened during his first episode out, if Richie is acting this way with Tony right out of the gate, imagine how much worse it would have been with his actual little brother. This combination of entitlement, naivety, and a superiority complex, amplified by the fact that his little brother was boss, would be defining factors in how Richie moved forward, and since he was already grabbing with both hands under Tony, under Jackie it probably would have been much worse. So, what would Richie want?
World, Chico. And everything in it.
Well, frankly, I think that Richie would expect to be more than just a capo, perhaps an underboss or consigliere with an unusually high influence over the boss, if not the behind-the-scenes shot caller. However, for the sake of this conversation, we will assume that he is willing to be just a capo, at least for the time being, which brings us to our first problem: capo of what crew? As things stood with Jackie dead, Richie naturally just took over the Aprile crew, which included the construction racket, but with Jackie alive, how much control would Richie have? Here I look at how Tony transitioned from being capo to boss, and I imagine Jackie would have acted in a similar fashion. Richie would have been made capo of the crew, have control over the people in it, and be the point of contact for upper management, but just like Tony with sanitation, Jackie wouldn't give up personal control of construction. After all, it's a whole lot of money, it's his and he doesn't have to, so why would he? And this would quickly and exponentially increase tensions between Richie and Tony. We've already seen, even with the construction racket, how aggressive Richie was with garbage and how irritating that was to Tony. A Richie without construction and a brother who is boss is bound to infuriate Tony and in the process at least annoy his brother, which brings us to the next conflict, this one almost inevitable, Jackie Sr. having to choose between Tony and Richie, but we will get back to that in a second. All the while this is going on, there may be growing tensions between Jackie and Richie over Jackie Jr. Of course, there is the possibility that Richie respects his brother's wishes to keep Jackie Jr. out of it, but there are two things going against that possibility. First,
when's the last time you gave a fuck about anybody with Richie Aprile?
He isn't a particularly respectful person, especially in regards to things that go against his own interest. Although, to be fair, as I mentioned in the Who's Craziest episode, Richie is someone who cares a lot about the Aprile name, and since his brother is a non-ballroom dancing Aprile as well, he might just respect his brother's wishes. For a time. As Jackie Jr.'s sister points out,
my brother's whole stupid, pathetic dream was to follow in our father's footsteps.
And he isn't going to stop pursuing that dream. Richie may turn him away once or twice, but he would never tell on him, and Jackie Jr. would just keep coming back. Anyways, as to the conflict between Richie and Tony, Jackie Sr. would have had to have been brought in to settle it, and the way it played out would have determined the future of the family to a large degree. Now, one of the things Jackie was known for was being fair.
I mean, when Jackie was acting boss, no one minded because it all evened out at the end of the day.
So it's safe to assume that he would make sure that his brother of all people would be taken care of, but it's also safe to assume that he wouldn't just start taking stuff away from Tony, especially since Tony was essential in Jackie's becoming boss, while his brother just wasn't. At this point, in order to move forward peacefully, Richie would have to trust that things will even out, which isn't like him, and accept the fact that he had to yield to Tony, at least in terms of garbage, something that he was unwilling to do when Tony was boss, so it's unlikely he will when Tony isn't. Now, at this point, an argument could be made Richie just didn't respect Tony as the boss, and that things would have been different if the orders were coming from his brother. However, I don't think that would be enough of the case to be of any long-term significance. While Richie certainly would be a bit more patient with his brother, his expectations would also be much higher, and at the end of the day, he would still view Jackie like he viewed Tony, as a kid that wouldn't have had the spot if he hadn't gone to jail, and that shouldn't have it now. The question then becomes, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, which would happen first? Richie making a move on Jackie, or Jackie thinking that Richie was going to make a move? The fact that they are brothers would slow that process down, but neither are naive enough to think that that sort of thing isn't a possibility. Personally, I think even if Richie decided first, he would run into the same problem that he did with Tony. It would be impossible for him to gather support without Jackie finding out. Of course, the other possibility, although less likely, is that Jackie sides primarily with Richie, eventually boiling over the tensions with Tony. If this were to happen, it would evolve into a family war between the Sopranos and Apriles because, in this case, Junior would side with Tony. Remember, Tony and Junior never fought it out for the top spot in this timeline, but Junior did fight it out with Jackie, so it's hard to picture him taking Jackie's side unless Tony was a huge underdog. That being said, if Jackie is even remotely pragmatic, he would have sided with Tony if for no other reason than Tony is more essential to Jackie maintaining power than Richie will ever be. So ultimately, unless Richie is willing to take what he would view as a backseat indefinitely, which I doubt he would, Jackie would end up having to make a move on him. Now, if Jackie would have died of natural causes after Richie got out, the resulting power struggle may have played out quite differently, although the end result would be the same, and the wild card would be Junior. As it stood, Richie and Junior were on the same side for a few reasons. First, neither thought that Tony should be running things. Second, they both had a chip on their shoulder due to having younger brothers who greatly surpassed them, and most importantly, Richie was willing to be subservient to Junior. If Jackie had died after Richie was released, Tony would have never been boss, and it's very unlikely that Richie would accept not taking his brother's spot. In this case, Junior would have either made a third-party run on his own, so to speak, or joined up with Tony. Either way, Tony would have come out on top. Junior wouldn't have had enough support to win on his own, and Richie would be counting on his brother's people to back him up. Unfortunately, he would have just spent the last year or so pissing them off to no end, so that's quite unlikely. Well, thanks for watching another episode here on Bully Whispers. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you at the next score.